caríssimos membros do corpo diplomático, caros painelistas, caros colegas de IESE, distintos convidados, minhas senhoras e meus senhores. Meu nome é Carrie Manning, como sabe, eu sou professor de Ciências Políticas na Georgia State University em Atlanta. Agradeço muito esta oportunidade de estar aqui convosco hoje. E peço desculpas, mas eu vou dar a minha intervenção em inglês. Muito obrigada. Okay, thank you once again for this opportunity to be here today. I would like to congratulate IESE on its 15th anniversary and on the holding of this 6th international conference on the theme of conflict, violence, and development. Can you all hear me? Okay. Yeah. For me, it's a special privilege to be here with you today on the eve of the 30th anniversary of the Rome Peace Accords. And this is in part because I first arrived in Mozambique in 1994 on the eve of the first elections. So I started my scholarly career here in Mozambique, and over the years I have followed Mozambique quite closely. I arrived as a doctoral student on a Fulbright with my family, and I had the opportunity to observe the first elections and this transition to peace. It's fair to say that this experience left an indelible and formative mark on my thinking about peace, about democracy, and about the relationship between the two. And although I've gone on to study these topics in many other countries, what I learned in Mozambique has really stuck with me and has, as I said, influenced my thinking. The insights I gained here have affected my choices of subjects to study and how I study them throughout my career. So I'm really grateful to the people in Mozambique who gave so much of their time and their energy to exchange views with me during that time and in the years since. And also those whose work and insights have influenced my own work, some of whom are here in this room. So I'm both honored and humbled to be invited to give this keynote address. As we said, this conference marks nearly 30 years since the signing of the General Peace Accords in Rome between the government of Mozambique and Renamo, putting an end to 16 years of war. The organizers of this conference have assembled a set of papers that examine essential questions about the challenges facing Mozambique at this moment. Many papers will examine the current conflict in Cabo Delgado, which seems like very fertile ground to interrogate the themes of conflict, violence, and development. Another set of papers tackles profound questions about economic choices through both historical and contemporary lenses. We'll also hear research presentations about the role of the state and non-state actors in conflict transformation. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from all the participants of this conference and to engaging with my colleagues and learning from their research. The title of my talk is Peace, Democracy, Liberal Peace Building in Mozambique 30 Years On. In my address, I want to examine the logic and the legacies of liberal peace building in a comparative context. And I want to examine three questions principally. First, what is the logic of liberal peace building? I have to confess that when I arrived in 1994 to study this process, I thought it was hard to think of a worse idea, right, than basing a peace process on a democratization process in a country that had not had prior experience with democracy. So how could we make peace building harder? Let's build it on top of democracy, was sort of what I thought when I arrived at the time. So I want to really examine this logic of liberal peace building both in theory and in practice, and ask why should peace and democracy go together? So this model has been pervasive, even over the 30 years, even as it has fallen out of fashion. So it matters, and I think we should examine it. The second question I want to address is how has this model worked in practice around the world and over 3 decades? I focus on one aspect in particular, the inclusion of armed opposition groups as political parties who then participate in elections. And finally, I'll say a few words about how we can apply this to Mozambique. I'm in a room full of experts on Mozambique, so that part will be brief and we'll have time to talk about these ideas over the next few days. So liberal peace building is the idea that peace can be built simultaneously with a process of formal democratization. Elections are front and center, although they aren't the only thing that matters. What do words like peace and democracy even mean in this context? I think the starting points here are procedural and minimalist. Peace is defined as the absence of conflict. Democracy is a set of rules that allows for regular, periodic, and reasonably fair elections. So we know that peace, democracy, and development don't always go together, right? On the contrary, there are very important tensions between them. And I think perhaps most importantly, peace, democratization, and development are not short-term outcomes. And they're not even outcomes in a sense, they're also processes, and they're long-term processes that have a long time horizon. They occur, they occur at different speeds, at different paces, and their progress doesn't sync up. The path is not linear. So this is messy. It's going to look messy at any given time. But the question really is, can electoral politics bring about the kind of substantive transition that we traditionally think of as real peace or positive peace, right? We're starting from a point of let's get negative peace, and let's do that through electoral politics. Okay, is that better? I hear so much echoing up here. I can't tell if it's better to be farther or closer. Okay. So Mozambique, as many of you will know, has been considered by many to be an early success story for this model of liberal peace building. And as I said, this model puts electoral politics at the core of the peace process. But elections by themselves don't make democracy, and democracy doesn't equal peace. Mozambique's experience over the last 30 years offers really rich terrain for an exploration of these questions. So, sort of, I think, counter to a lot of expectations in 1994, Mozambique saw what was a successful initial transition and 20 years of peace. But after that, there was renewed conflict between Renamo and the government in 2013, which lasted 6 years, as you know. Nevertheless, electoral politics was not abandoned, and on the contrary, the peace deal that eventually ended the conflict was based on promises of greater inclusion for opposition and an expansion of electoral politics. We're, of course, now experiencing an ongoing insurgency in Cabo Delgado that started in 2017, and while this is a different sort of conflict in many important ways from the one fought between Renamo and the government decades earlier, one could argue that it perhaps has some of the same root causes and dynamics. Today, Mozambique's political opposition parties face many challenges. We've seen the fracturing of Renamo following the death of its longtime leader, Afonso Dhlakama. The ruling party continues to return overwhelming electoral victories, controlling the majority of elected positions at all levels of government. There's ongoing concern about the freeness and fairness of elections. We finally have a significant third party, MDM, which has been especially prominent in municipal politics. And finally, during this time, Mozambique's economy has undergone a structural transformation, as we know, moving toward an extractive-based economy. So a lot has changed in the interim, right, since that, in these 30 years. Mozambique was one of the first countries, as I said, to be put through the experience of international peace building via democratization. And this idea that democratization was not only possible for a country with Mozambique's political, social, and economic history, but indeed that it was the essential foundation for peace, was surprising and new. Until the Cold War ended in 1990, democracy was seen by many scholars, most scholars, as a form of government reserved for wealthy nations. There were a number of theories about why democracy and development went hand in hand, and conflicting ideas about why. But the bottom line was that stability and relative wealth were thought to precede democracy and to be an essential precondition. However, in some sense, these theories were simply descriptions of the ways that the West democratized, rather than universal laws of social, economic, or political change as they were sometimes presented. So when the Cold War ended, many of the pressures generated by a world polarized between the Soviet bloc and the West shifted. Many insurgencies drew to a close as external support for them dried up. International organizations like the UN, as well as Western donors, saw an opportunity to rethink their relationships with less developed countries. In parallel, in the 1980s, political liberalization had come to be seen by international financial institutions as a key part of correcting what was seen as economic mismanagement and misguided state-centric policy. There was a renewed pitch for market-led solutions, and market-led solutions were to be accompanied by political mechanisms to allow for transparency and accountability that could make those market mechanisms work. Democratization was also proposed as a means to that end, to bringing improved economic performance and management. 10 years later, we would see democracy being proposed as a midwife of peace. So Boutros Boutros-Ghali, the then Secretary General of the United Nations, wrote an agenda for peace in June 1992. And he wrote it in response to a request from the Security Council to plan for a more robust role for the United Nations in promoting peace in the world. By the end of the Cold War, the number of conflicts within states far outnumbered the number of conflicts between states. Boutros-Ghali noted that intra-state wars were more apt to bring state collapse, or at least a need for significant reconstruction, not only of physical infrastructure of the state, but also a shoring up of state institutions and functions that could address people's needs and conflicting demands. So peace building then became bound up with state building, and state building was part of a process of democratization. Isla Matinock, in her 2017 book, Electing Peace, writes that provisions in peace accords that called for elections in which former belligerents could face one another at the ballot box was convenient for international actors, including the UN and other bilateral actors, because it gave them a handle they could use to engage effectively in countries that were recently in conflict. Elections are highly visible, time-limited, and consequential events. So by monitoring elections and enforcing electoral standards, international actors were enforcing the peace agreement in a way that seemed feasible and limited. So these are some of the pragmatic reasons, I think, why we end up with a model of liberal peace building, why it has become so widespread. But what was the impact on the countries that were on the receiving end of this set of ideas in practice? And again, could a country with no experience in democracy really build such a system in the immediate aftermath of war? And could it serve as a basis for long-term stability? This idea seems to fly in the face of what academics thought we knew about democratization up to that point. As I said, much of the conventional wisdom about democracy and democratization was based on a historical look back at contemporary Western democracies. Because well-established democracies have certain conditions, the logic goes, we assume that it is these conditions that enable democracy. According to these theories, we have to recreate these conditions in order for democracy to succeed. But what if it's the processes that led to these conditions that we need to examine instead? Maybe democratization starts long before these preconditions exist. What we need to create, perhaps, is not the conditions that obtain and establish democracies today, but the processes that led to them. I think consciously or not, this is the logic that underlies the policy of liberal peace building, and is consistent with the view of Swedish scholar Dankwart Rostow, who wrote a very influential article in 1970 where he proposed some startling ideas, where he highlighted the difference between the start of democracy, the genesis of democracy, and what keeps it going. And he highlighted the fact that democracy is a dynamic, non-linear process. Perhaps most importantly, Rostow's work highlighted the conflict as a starting point, as an integral part of the model, not a problem to be overcome before democracy can work. So for Rostow, conflict is key, and there are no background conditions for democratization. For Rostow, there is one background condition, and that is that everyone agrees on the boundaries of the political community. Beyond that, he sees conflict as an essential catalyst for motivating conflicting elites, elites to put in place a series of processes that can regulate their conflict. Okay, so he says a people, quote, a people who are not in conflict about some rather fundamental matters would have little need to devise democracy's elaborate rules for conflict resolution. And the acceptance of these rules is logically a part of the transition process rather than its prerequisite. So that last part I think is important. The acceptance of the rules is part of the transition process rather than its prerequisite. He wasn't necessarily talking about violent conflict. He was talking about, though, very entrenched, serious conflict between elites. Okay, and then he goes on to talk about a habituation phase where once these rules are adopted, they begin to be practiced. Those who invest in these rules tend to succeed, right? So he sort of talks about a Darwinian dynamic where those who work hardest to adopt to the new rules will do the best under it, and then they will become even more committed over time. So bottom line, to build democracy, says Rustow, we don't need committed Democrats. We only need agreement to play by a set of rules. Conflict and a desire to end that conflict creates that motivation to put those rules in place. And over time, participation in a system creates actors who have a vested interest in that system. Thus, the longer they participate, the less likely they are to opt out of the system entirely. Mutual vulnerability between these contending elites to one another is key here. Okay, so, but what we know from looking at democratization around the world is that it's very rare that one system ever replaces another system of government, right? So electoral politics might just be providing a legitimizing cover for armed actors to regain their strength before attempting to gain dominance over the state by force if necessary. Or electoral politics might be practiced diligently and in good faith, but it has been laid on top of existing patterns of politics and informal economic and political power structures without really making any changes in those patterns. So the two coexist. Third possibility, which is not necessarily in conflict with either of the first two, is that Rustow's hypothesized dynamics occur, that is, that repeated participation in electoral politics over time itself does bring change, does change actors, builds norms, builds expectations, strengthens and creates new kinds of political and civil society actors. But the key here is time, a long time, and the offering over that period of time of predictable, consistent incentives. So when you have a system of regular and periodic elections, each election presents parties with a choice, right? A party may seek to improve its electoral performance by adapting to the competitive context in which it finds itself, by, for example, changing its electoral appeals, recruiting candidates differently, or engaging in electoral coalitions. These changes can increase a party's stake in participating in electoral politics and ensuring the rules are followed, because each of those changes implies risks for leaders. A party may also seek to manipulate the electoral process. It may choose to use violence to mobilize support, or it may choose to exit from political competition altogether. But as Brazil Mazula once said, elections and reconciliation and peace are built every day. So every day there are choices that we can make, and I'm sort of transferring this to the idea of elections. At every election, parties have to make a choice. Will I invest? Will I avoid? How will I continue to participate? So these decisions in each electoral cycle create incentives for changes within parties, and over the long term, they add up into strategies of electoral engagement that can impact not only the party's electoral chances, but also its impact on the political system it's part of. So they're of critical importance not only for the establishment of electoral politics per se, but for the consolidation of a political system that can be resilient over the long term. The key here, as I said, is time and small changes over time. And usually this time horizon is much longer than what people are looking for. It's certainly longer than donors' budget cycles. It's even longer than what most scholars are paying attention to. It's longer than the projected careers of individual politicians. So that I think is a theoretical basis for liberal peace building. Now, although I'm not aware of any international peace building actor having read Rustow's article, it does a pretty good job, I think, of summing up what we would have to infer are the underlying assumptions of a liberal peace building model. Okay, so far, I've set out practical and theoretical reasons why liberal peace building might have been seen as worth trying. And in the next section, I want to talk about some research that I've been doing with two colleagues that tracks all armed opposition groups that became political parties over decades to trace how they participate in electoral politics. So we're trying to examine the empirical evidence for one of liberal peace building's core elements, which is the electoral inclusion of armed insurgent groups by inviting them to become political parties and compete in elections. So, of course, we're all well aware that putting democratization, however flawed or limited, at the center of international peace building was in part a decision of convenience. It served both the rhetorical and material needs of the West in the post-Cold War era. They may or may not have relied on any theories. But we've also seen that there may be some theoretical support for the idea. So our idea in this research is, let's take these ideas seriously. Let's examine one central aspect of this model, and let's see what has happened over the last 30 years. So, as you know, in the aftermath of almost all civil wars that ended after 1990, no matter when, where, or why they began, why these wars began, armed opposition groups had the opportunity to form political parties and to participate in post-war electoral politics. And this isn't just conflicts that end right after the Cold War. It's not even just conflicts that begin before the Cold War. It's any conflict that ends after the Cold War. So our data set includes all conflicts that started. Some started in the 60s, some started in the 80s, some in the 70s. If they end after 1990, they're included in our data set. If they start after 1990, they're also included in our data set. So we are trying to capture this era of liberal peace building, as we say. So there's been a lot of work on these transitions, right? There's been a lot of work on why do rebel groups decide to form political parties, what happens to them in the first elections. But there's been almost no work tracking them beyond the first or the second election. So that's what we are trying to do. And so we've built a global data set, and that's where we are. So in starting this work, we suspected that post-rebel parties might actually have some advantages over new opposition parties in other kinds of new democracies, right? So we're starting from the democratization literature, but thinking, okay, maybe these parties, I'm shorthanding them as post-rebel parties. I know that's not a great name, but bear with me. So in most new democracies, you have a fragmented opposition and a ruling party that's been in power a long time. In post-war cases, you also often have a ruling party that's been in power for a long time. But you also often have a single or a few opposition parties that are formed out of these armed insurgent groups, which might not have any real political experience, although, of course, some do. But they do have broad name recognition and organizational legacies of having been an insurgency. So they may have a well-developed organizational hierarchy, perhaps some complexity in terms of the development of different bureaus for the performance of different tasks, rules for decision-making, and so on. So scholars have written of these transferable capabilities that armed opposition groups can bring into the political arena. Parties that are formed out of armed groups have a clear brand, and they, along with the ruling party, often fall back on the appeals they used to mobilize followers during wartime once they get to the political arena. This keeps that wartime cleavage alive, which also could mean it just entrenches divisions. But here we see the tension between peace building and democratization. Right, for democratization, what you want is a party system with deeply entrenched cleavages and political parties that really represent positions. They represent, deeply entrenched positions. For peace building, relying on the wartime cleavage keeps these parties in the game because it's easy for them. They don't have to face as much organizational change if voters will still vote for them simply because there's polarization in the political arena and they still stand for the same thing. So there's that tension. A trump card that these parties also have that other new parties don't have, not necessarily a great thing for peace, either, is that they have the ability to organize violence. So this actually can give them confidence in the short term to participate, and then if they don't like it, to leave. Again, that's not great. But it does give them some leverage and perhaps some confidence to threaten with in case they feel they are cheated and so on. So as I said, our study looks at all post-rebel parties formed after any conflict ending in 1990 or later that meets the Uppsala Conflict Data Program's criteria for civil war, large or small, and it only includes conflict episodes that have ended. Our data cover both the parties that formed immediately from the rebel group, the primary rebel group, at the war to peace transition, and also the parties that break off from them over time. We then track each party's participation and performance in each available national legislative election since the end of the war. Our data also includes details on how parties participate in elections. For example, we code parties' participation in electoral coalitions. When a party fails to participate, we also code the reason for their lack of participation. Did they boycott? Were they banned? Did they disband? Did they merge with another party? So this can allow for further qualitative study. And as I said, our data cover up to 3 decades now of post-war electoral politics, following post-rebel parties through as many as 10 consecutive legislative election cycles. So, in this historical period that we cover since 1990, we've seen a huge amount of variety in the kinds of states that end up in our set of cases. So it includes, of course, states formed after the dissolution of large multinational states like the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, giving rise to a number of new independent republics like Georgia, Moldova, Tajikistan, Kosovo, Croatia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina. Some of these new republics in turn spurred further attempts at new state formation, resulting in unrecognized de facto republics in South Ossetia, for example. These are also included. As we've discussed, the end of the Cold War also brought conflicts in Africa and Asia to an end. Rulers or opposition groups that had relied on economic or military aid from the US or the Soviet Union to conduct counterinsurgencies had to find other strategies. And so many of these wars ended. Along with these, long-running proxy conflicts in Latin America also came to an end as their Cold War patrons withdrew support in cases like Colombia and El Salvador. So the end of the Cold War saw many conflicts ending, and soon after that, many new ones beginning. And in this whole period, to this vastly diverse array of countries and conflicts, we have a new model of peace building applied that puts democracy building, at least in a formal sense, front and center. So, like I said, we have this data set. It includes information on 81 post-rebel parties derived from 58 distinct conflict actors in 40 countries. And these countries include conflicts that vary in their duration, their intensity, and the incompatibility, and lots of other factors. Yet, while the parties in our data set represent tremendous diversity in terms of their origins, their experience, their resources, and the environments, we find that their patterns of participation and performance are remarkably stable over time, and this was a big surprise for us. So we found that in the aftermath of civil war, more than half armed opposition groups that have the opportunity to form a political party and to compete in post-war elections do so. And so unless they're legally banned from participating, which is a very rare outcome, the overwhelming majority of these groups do form political parties. And nearly all that do form parties go on to participate in that first general election post-war. Moreover, 65% of the parties that engage in those first elections go on to participate in every available legislative election thereafter. So we're tracking legislative elections here. 65% participate in all elections going forward. This includes everyone from Sinn Féin to Renamo to the FMLN, right? Parties that have a background as parties, parties that don't. Additionally, the electoral performance of these parties tends to remain fairly consistent over time. So the first elections really sets a precedent. The sort of performance band that a party starts in tends to be where it stays over time. There's, of course, variation, but there's usually not wild variation. If a party fails to participate in the first post-war election, it rarely recovers, rarely comes back in. Okay, and we also have nearly a quarter of these parties have competed in at least, by now, 5 electoral contests over 2 decades or more. So remember, we're not just looking at parties whose conflicts ended in 1990. We're looking at parties whose conflicts ended any time after that. Right, so looking at that whole data set, a quarter of them have already participated in 5 elections over 20 years or more. These we're calling our long-haul parties. So there are very, very few parties in this group that never participated in a single election. So also we find, concerningly I suppose, that participation by these parties in elections is not dependent on the quality of the election itself, suggesting that post-rebel parties find electoral participation valuable regardless of electoral quality. So what is going on here? Why are these parties continuing to stay in this game even when elections are flawed or compromised and they're not doing well? The final finding that I want to highlight is that parties returning to conflict after, if a party participates in 2 elections, it's extremely rare that it returns to conflict. There are 2 exceptions, Renamo in Mozambique and party in Yemen, which returned to conflict when a new conflict broke out there. Okay, so as I said, to me, this degree of consistency in participation of these parties over time suggests that the conversion of armed groups to electoral parties is a strategy that is viable across disparate contexts and actors. There's a lot of questions that remain unanswered. Why do so many rebel groups find electoral politics a satisfactory substitute for war? And under what conditions will they continue to find it a satisfactory substitute for war? I think the initial explanation for, the explanation for initial party formation is pretty straightforward. External actors supporting peace processes over the last 30 years have often expected and supported party formation by rebel groups. Many rebel groups, as I said, already had strong name recognition. They had developed a brand, if you will, during the war. And many of them would compete in political arenas with few or no pre-existing opposition parties, right? So they were the dominant opposition parties, in a sense, on arrival into politics. There were very low startup costs and high opportunity costs of not participating. Moreover, transforming into an electoral party provided a legitimate position at the table, at the political table, sort of a ticket for admission to the process of politics. So the decision initially to participate may have been just a low-risk way to keep going while keeping their options open, right? To keep your organization alive, keep your options open. The real puzzle for me is participation of these groups in elections over time. But as we saw, it turns out that the majority of parties that participated in the first post-war elections then went on to participate in all elections. So, 2 questions. Which parties continue to participate in elections over time? Is their long-term participation tied to their electoral performance? It's not, we found. Is it tied to organizational legacies from the past? Yes, to a degree. Is it tied to institutional characteristics of the political arena? No, not really. So one factor, of course, that helps explain the performance of these parties is how the war ended, in a fairly obvious way, right? If an armed opposition group wins the war militarily, it is almost certain to become a dominant, the incumbent, and then to become a dominant party, winning 60% or more. If a party loses militarily, if an armed group loses militarily, it often does not form a party at all and does not participate. But the vast majority of these armed opposition groups are in neither category. They're consistently winning between 0 and 10%, or 10 and 20%, or 20 to 50% on average across elections. For many of these parties that lie in the middle, that don't win or just drop out, a key part of the equation is whether or not their wartime cleavage continues to be relevant. And you'll see in a few minutes, we'll talk about how relevant that was here. Because when these wartime cleavages, these wartime mobilizing appeals remain relevant, the party has to do a lot less work in order to attract electors, especially if the electoral environment is already very polarized, right? So there's no need to engage in big big organizational changes to make one's party more competitive if you're pretty sure your voter base is reliable, and keeping that wartime cleavage alive is a way to do this. The question is, how do you keep that wartime cleavage alive without keeping the possibility of war constantly alive, right? How does that get converted into something that politics can deal with effectively? The political arena, the context of the political arena that these parties enter also matters for their performance. So parties, as I said, that enter where they're the main opposition group, they obviously do a lot better. If there are pre-existing electoral parties from a prior time period, they tend to crowd out these new rebel parties. So in that sense, the dynamics of democratization in these cases is quite similar to the dynamics in democratization in these sort of fourth wave countries more broadly. It's interesting, though, that we find that the specific rules of electoral competition, which were the topic of so much concern and so much design, right, at this time in the early era of liberal peace building, don't really matter that much, right? We don't find distinctive, systemic differences between parties that are competing in a presidential system versus a parliamentary system, proportionality, and things like that. I think what does matter, though, is whether or not there are subnational elections. Because elections at provincial level or municipal level can make it easier for parties. They have lower startup costs. So a party can establish itself at a municipal level and then move on to politics from there. So that was one interesting insight. It might also be that the rules of the game initially are trumped by other factors, other informal factors. Okay, finally, I think it's important to remember that electoral inclusion of these parties can have systemic effects. So we've talked a little bit about the impact of these parties on, the impact of participation on the parties themselves, but these parties are also impacting the party system. So recently, with a colleague, I published an article about that, right? Are we seeing the establishment of party systems in some of these cases? And what a party system does, a strong party system does, is it creates stability and predictability for voters and for other parties, encouraging potentially the new parties to enter the electoral game, giving them information about what kinds of appeals will be successful, and so forth. And also, we also find that new competitors include breakaway parties formed by former militants of the main post-rebel party, which is, again, something that we've seen here, who believe that they can compete successfully, more successfully than their parent party. Okay, so what these findings show, I think, once again, is that electoral inclusion has been an effective means of political integration for these non-state armed groups. Ultimately, addressing the political aspirations of conflict actors through electoral inclusion can help support lasting political peace, but it's not a foregone conclusion, right? Obviously, there's more to democracy than elections. There's more to peace than this sort of formal politics. But if we're examining just this one element of the peace-building process, I think it is having some impact. Of course, elections are not always guarantors of democracy. Autocrats also use elections to legitimize their power. And even if new parties formed out of armed opposition groups do embrace electoral politics, they often still retain the capacity to mobilize organized violence, or they can quickly regain that capacity. Renamo's return to arms after 2 decades of peace shows this pretty clearly. And yet, the return of peace after that coincided, as I said, with the expansion of electoral politics and promises of more inclusion in electoral administration for opposition parties. So I think that's worth examining. We find that even problematic elections are serving a purpose for these parties. External legitimation may play an important role. Aid and investment may suffer, for example, if the ruling party were to dispense with elections altogether in a given country. And opposition parties would lose access to even meager benefits by not participating in it. So, for example, if the main income for your political party is the salaries of deputies or some percentage thereof, or a subsidy from the state, this is likely to make it more difficult for you to simply leave, to exit the game. So maybe we're not building democracy with electoral politics so far, but maybe we are building a path toward peace. We'll see. Okay, in the last section of my talk, I want to say a little bit about Mozambique's experience and sort of how it fits in with this general model that I've traced. So as we all know, in October 1992, Mozambique's ruling party, Frelimo, signed a comprehensive peace agreement with Renamo. Peace did provide for the inclusion of Renamo as a legal political party in a multi-party political system that was just 2 years old. Since independence, the country had been governed under a one-party state led by Frelimo. So there have been 6 national legislative and presidential elections. Renamo has participated in all of them. The party has averaged around 30% of the legislative seat share across all elections. From the end of the Civil War in 1992 until 2009, Renamo and Frelimo were the only 2 parties that mattered in Mozambican politics. Renamo ran on the identity it had established in wartime as a representative of all those excluded from the ruling party's monopoly on political and economic opportunity. This had continued resonance after the war, And indeed, this appeal was picked up and implemented and sort of supported by new actors in subsequent elections in 2009 and later. Although I don't have time to get into those details to make that case. Because RENAMO could continue to rely on its wartime organizational appeals, and because FRELIMO continued to do the same, and because this made for a political arena that, as I said, was so polarized between these two parties. Certainly initially, there was little chance of any politicians leaving FRELIMO to go to RENAMO and vice versa, right? These were solidly polarized, a solidly polarized system. Because of this, RENAMO did very little in the way of organization building, right? It didn't have to work hard for that vote share, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. So RENAMO relied on the charisma of its leader, Afonso Dhlakama, to keep order in a party that remained highly personalized and centralized. The development of institutions that might create predictable paths to leadership and advancement in the party was not countenanced under Dhlakama's leadership. The party's elected legislators had no real autonomy from the party's leadership. This is different from what we find in highly organizationally developed parties, right? And so thus paths to organizational development and growth were effectively blocked. There were lacking these incentives to change that. So 15 years after the Civil War ended, a third party, Mozambique Democratic Movement, emerged that was able to cut into RENAMO's electoral base. RENAMO's legislative seat share fell dramatically in the fourth national elections in 2009, and around this same time, Mozambique's economy was transforming into one based on significant reserves of coal and natural gas, among other things. So the pie, the economic pie, was expanding. The gains that could be had from controlling the state were expanding, and RENAMO was feeling increasingly excluded. So RENAMO's declining electoral fortunes, combined with a lucrative new economy and the ruling party's increasing willingness to compromise electoral integrity to maintain its grip on power, seemed to foretell the imminent disappearance of RENAMO as a political force. Would-be reformers in the party pushed for changes to try to make the party more competitive, more internally democratic, but those voices did not prevail. So as the economic stakes of maintaining political power spiked with the extractive resource boom, FRELIMO's commitment to electoral politics also seemed to wane a little bit. Both parties thus were willing to return to war to revise their 1992 political settlement. RENAMO used its capacity for violence to renegotiate the terms of its political inclusion. So in 2013, it returned to arms and began a 5-year low-intensity insurgency. Now, what's interesting is that legislative and presidential elections were scheduled for the next year, for 2014. And with the aid of international negotiators, RENAMO and the government reached a temporary agreement that included limited electoral administration reforms to allow them to go forward. While RENAMO missed the 2013 municipal elections, and MDM made very large gains in those elections, which was telling, I think. So voter support surged for RENAMO in 2014, with the party winning 36% of legislative seats, and this result seemed to validate the party's return to arms in the view of some. Negotiations between the government and RENAMO continued, now focusing on improving the inclusion of RENAMO personnel in the defense and security forces, which was a longstanding grievance of something that had not been fully implemented from the original peace accord. Dhlakama reached agreement with President Nyusi in 2017 on creating elected provincial government. A long-time RENAMO demand that the party expected would expand its representation in government significantly. Dhlakama died in May of 2018, as we know, and without established procedures in place for leadership succession, a power struggle ensued within the party, and the party split into two factions. The leader elected at the party's conference was a longtime cadre who had gone on to become a legislator in the National Assembly. The other faction comprised a group of RENAMO military leaders who had never been fully integrated into political life, but who had instead been part of the party's strategy to reserve the capacity for violence. The second wing, claiming to represent Dhlakama's RENAMO, launched a low-intensity armed conflict with the government in the center of the country, which was eventually extinguished. A new peace agreement was eventually reached between RENAMO and the government that allowed the October 2019 general election to go forward. Renamo suffered major defeats at every level, but provincial and national levels. Joe Hanlon and others have pointed out that elections have been subject to increasing levels of fraud and manipulation. 2019 was no exception. Okay, so what do we take away from this? First, I think Renamo's experience shows how post-rebel parties with fairly low capacity as a political party organization can remain, if you will, committed to the electoral process as part of a long-term strategy, but without making adaptations that would allow the party to withstand major challenges like the ones that Renamo faced. At the same time, Frelimo doubled down on its efforts to secure its grip on power through its control of elections. And once it became clear to Renamo militants that elections were no longer a viable, reliable avenue to political inclusion, the party turned instead to violence. But formally, the new peace deal actually reaffirmed electoral politics as the core of the settlement, putting an end to this conflict episode. So there's a lot to unpack in this experience. I think it's not at all clear that electoral results are accepted still by either of the two major parties as the last word in the allocation of power. Renamo has routinely contested the results of every election, while consistent problems with transparency and other irregularities of election administration suggest that the ruling party is not eager to surrender its fate to the uncertainty of free and fair elections. The lines between the ruling Frelimo party and the state have remained blurred at best over the years. Frelimo has now controlled the Mozambican state for nearly 50 years. In our comparative research, we find that post-rebel parties engage in one of three strategies when they stay engaged in electoral politics over the long term. And we're sort of developing a theory about these strategies of engagement as possible predictors of longer term outcomes, or I don't know if it's going to predict anything, but explainers. So we have a group of parties that adopt a competitive strategy where they truly invest in democratic politics. They see that their future is there. They are willing to undertake organizational changes to get there, such as recruiting candidates in different ways, forming coalitions with other parties, and so on. Probably going to be more likely to see this where democracy is more well established. So Sinn Féin's recent victories in Northern Ireland are sort of an interesting example of a transformation of a party over time in this way. So this is a real investment in democratization as such. The second strategy I call a strategy of accommodation. And this is where parties participate in elections, but they are seeking accommodations. So elections are the opening bid, and then they use their electoral participation as a tool to demonstrate their willingness to play ball, their ability to get people to vote for them, to demonstrate their legitimacy and their popularity to internal and external audiences, but they don't accept electoral results as the last word. So a common feature in these strategies is that the party uses its electoral participation to gain accommodation, to gain leverage for changing the Constitution or changes in the rules of participation, rather than treating electoral competition and current political settlement as the last word in the struggle for power. This is, of course, the most common strategy, and we're likely to see this where actors are a little bit uncertain about how long democracy might last or how strong it is. And the third strategy that we see is really one of power consolidation. So where parties are able, where they're consistently winning 50% of the vote or higher, they're likely to still participate in elections, again, as a legitimation device to hold elections, but they do not intend to lose elections. And so I think we have, in Renamo, we have accommodation. In Frelimo, we may be seeing a power consolidation strategy, but there's nothing inevitable about either one of these strategies for the future. Again, parties learn and choose as they participate in each election. And also, interestingly, these strategies are not linked to parties' performance, except for power consolidation, right? So if we look at all the parties in our data set that follow a competitive strategy, we have parties in there that are doing pretty poorly by anybody's standards, like parties that are winning 10% or less of the seats in parliament. But still they are showing they're investing in this competitive strategy. We also have parties that adopt an accommodation strategy that that are at all levels of electoral performance. Okay, so now to your great relief, I'm sure, I'm going to conclude. And by saying first that, as I said, I think the results of our broad comparative study show that if we look globally, electoral inclusion of former armed opposition groups can bring stability and perhaps lasting peace. This doesn't depend on past experience with democracy or on the existence of strong political parties well-versed in electoral politics at the outset. Electoral inclusion can lead to enduring stability even where elections are consistently flawed, and it can prevail in highly polarized environments where the only viable parties are those that participated in the war as armed actors. But there is a breaking point. So if elections are consistently manipulated to allow incumbents to retain dominance, then elections can no longer be a plausible avenue to provide a route to power for anyone else. Electoral politics then becomes a mechanism for electoral exclusion. This signals essentially the incumbent's withdrawal from the post-war political settlement. This is a common outcome in lots of countries in the world. This withdrawal from this settlement might not become evident immediately. Several electoral cycles will likely be necessary for a ruling party to demonstrate its unwillingness to truly invest in electoral politics. So in short, this model of liberal peace building can give us peace, and it can give us, it can function, albeit limping along for a very long time, but it has a breaking point. So it continues to work only so long as no party just abandons the game altogether. And I want to add here that this is a huge challenge. In any democracy, whoever controls the state today is also a contender for power tomorrow. So the temptation to ensure that the rules and procedures of electoral competition are not going to prevent you from holding on to power is great. And I give you the example of former President Donald Trump. The majority of the leadership currently of the Republican Party in the US right now is an example, calling into question the legitimacy of elections if I don't win. So this is a challenge that isn't just faced by new democracies or post-conflict democracies. Excellencies, distinguished guests and participants, ladies and gentlemen, there's a lot to unpack in what I've said. I've sought to review both theoretical and practical reasons for the emergence of the liberal peace-building model. I've drawn on research into one aspect of this practice, the electoral inclusion of armed actors who are expected to develop a peaceful stake in politics. I've shown, I think, that a surprising number of these actors find this arrangement satisfactory, and by looking closely at the case of Mozambique, we find this model is very resilient up to a point. I hope I've given you some things to think about that you might find relevant as we move into a much fuller discussion of the dynamics of violence, development, and conflict in the coming days, and I look forward to exchanging ideas with you. To the conference organizers, thank you once again for this opportunity to share some of these thoughts with you. To members of the audience, thank you very much for your attention and your patience.